So setting the optimal teaching environment is essential for any teaching, whether it's physical or whether it's online. And I'm sure some of you have experience already of the occasional teaching using an online platform. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I'll be talking about some of the technical considerations, which can be the most anxiety-inducing elements of online teaching, particularly where organisations are scaling up their online provision. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to talk too much about tool selection, as I anticipate that many of you will be using an online platform that's supported across your institution. If you have IT support for a particular tool, I'd always recommend that you try to use that wherever possible. That way, if anything does go wrong, you have a greater chance of getting things up and running again much quicker. So most of the tools that are listed on this slide have interactivity features to increase audience engagement, although these can sometimes be limited depending on the numbers you're likely to get. So as we were saying earlier, that's one of the reasons that there's not much interactivity in our session apart from the Q&A, because we were expecting such large numbers today. So at the Open University, we mostly use Adobe Connect. So the reason that we use Adobe Connect is that all modules conduct their live sessions on this platform. So for those of you who do have a bit of freedom with a tool selection, for help choosing a tool, I'd recommend the link on the slide now, which is to Durham University's guide on selecting an online platform. Next slide, please. So today I'll be focusing on the main tool that we use at the Open University, Adobe Connect. So it isn't free. Prices do vary depending on the type of subscription you require. So the picture on this slide demonstrates what it looks like. So what the students will see when they join the session is on the left side of the red bar. So what we normally use this for when students join is to have some slides preloaded in advance, just to give them some indication of how the tool works and some of the interactivity features to familiarise themselves with using the tool. The section on the right is just for you as the presenter, so you can drag activities into that space, work on them, and then put them back out onto the left-hand side so that the students can see them. So any activity that you want to run within Adobe Connect, so like your polls, question and answers, screen shares, and your slides are preloaded in advance into the teaching room. So it's almost the equivalent of bringing your resources into the physical classroom, just in an online space. If you're demonstrating URLs, similar to how you would in person, it's advisable to have these open on your browser in preparation so that you're ready to go, especially if your internet speed is quite slow. Next slide, please. So bear in mind that you'll likely be delivering teaching to an audience with varying technical capabilities, using all sorts of different terminology. So even today, there's quite a few people who have reported audio issues. For this reason, we always have this introductory set of slides in our Adobe Connect sessions, just so that students can sort out any issues that they might have before the start of the session. You might consider allowing participants to enter maybe 10 to 15 minutes prior to class, depending on numbers. And this gives them time to resolve any technical issues before you start, reducing the risk of interrupting your class time. Next slide, please. So consider recording your session so that anyone who cannot attend still has access to the training at a time that is suitable to them. This also allows anyone who have experienced technical problems at the live event to re-watch any part that they've missed. So this is something that we usually do for our sessions. And this recording can then be uploaded to VLEs or YouTube channels, allowing that 24/7 access to training resources. Just bear in mind that you might need to set aside some editing time for this, particularly as interactive elements of your session can be difficult to follow during a rewatch, so you might decide to cut those out. We mainly use Camtasia to edit our videos and record all our sessions, just as a kind of policy. If you're concerned about the data protection side of things, you can always record your session to an empty room where you just set up a private event just for yourself to record the session. By having a recording, this means that your attendees won't necessarily have to take copious notes as well. Next slide, please. So as an online university, Adobe Connect is embedded into students' modules already. Therefore, our audience tends to have some experience of using it. All our students have access to the computing guide, which is on the screen now, and it gives advice and details about how Adobe Connect works and how they can utilize any features. So using a tool supported by your organization can save a lot of time. Guides like this one might already exist, which will then save you time by not needing to write guidelines from scratch. At my previous workplace, we started trialing online workshops and had regular one-to-one training using Zoom. And because this wasn't supported by the university, we created guidance and had to send it out on an individual basis to students in advance by email. And it was an accessible user guide. And this introduced them to the tool, but it also took up quite a lot of staff time. Next slide, please. So importantly, you as the teacher want to be as comfortable as possible in delivering your training. One of the most daunting things about online training is the concern that your technology won't work, or you may forget how to do something in the moment. So this is the second time that we've run this session, and at the first one, I had a power cut shortly before it started, and I was worried that I wasn't going to make it. So that's why it's important to kind of run through any sessions in advance and check any tasks and links before you go live. From your point of view as a teacher, Wi-Fi connections can sometimes be unstable. So if you have an Ethernet cable, try and use that where possible. This is particularly useful when if you have any video content, because that takes up a lot of bandwidth. So wherever possible, just ensure that your webcam is turned off. It's also worth checking up on others in your household as well. Gaming and streaming videos can slow down your internet connections quite dramatically. Next slide, please. So to create the optimum study environment, consider using a headset, particularly if you cannot find a good quiet space where you normally work. This helps to reduce feedback, thus making your voice much clearer for your attendees, as well as increasing the chance of a good quality recording. With larger numbers, you'll need to take the decision whether or not to ensure silence by turning off microphone rights for participants, like we did today, designing your teaching around the expected numbers, well, wherever that is possible, of course. So because we were expecting such large numbers today, we set up the room without microphone access to spare your ears of any feedback. And unfortunately cannot facilitate much in the way of interactivity like we normally would. With smaller groups, this is much less of an issue, but just be aware that if you do allow microphone rights, you might be privy to some background noises that are out of your control. And it's worth noting that even without microphones, interactivity can still be achieved through things like chat, polls. You can also split attendees up into groups using breakout rooms function that many tools have now, and also creating tasks for them to complete in class. So we are always developing our online pedagogies. So we usually include a pre and post session poll just to gather feedback about the personal learning objectives of our attendees. So even if you take all these precautions, you still might find yourself on the wrong side of technology, and things do go wrong. So if you're trying to ensure kind of minimal disruption, if it's possible, and make sure you have a backup member of staff who can easily take over if you're thrown out of a room. So you can facilitate this by creating a script of your session, not so that you have to stick rigidly to it, but it just helps somebody else to take over from you if needed. This support staff member can also monitor the chats, responding to individual inquiries and bringing more important questions to the attention of the main deliverer. So that's something similar to how we set it up today. We have a script for this session, so if any one of us drops out, somebody else can flawlessly take over. Because we were expecting such large numbers of people, we've got a few members of staff monitoring the question and answers today. Next slide, please. It's also very important, particularly in light of the current situation, to think about your students' home setup, the equipment they may or may not have, their schedules, and potentially any extra responsibilities that they have during this time. Many students might feel apprehensive about using a new online tool and thus not really sure what to expect. So this is where a good guide can come in handy. And the allowance to let them arrive early just to test out their technology. You might also want to do some research where resources allow into optimum times to encourage attendance. So at the Open University, we've conducted a vast amount of research to come up with our programme of generic sessions, which are those that are open to all students. The outcomes of this research showed that most were available during sort of lunchtime and later evening sessions, so post 7 o'clock, so that students can attend outside of their work times and around any other commitments they have. It's also important to think about how long your session needs to be. Some lectures and workshops can be 2 hours or more, and you just need to consider whether this is suited to online audiences or if there's something you can do to make it a little bit shorter. If you've created a script, it can be helpful to send this out to students in advance of the session. This is particularly useful for students with disabilities or English as a second language. Next slide, please. So after all this effort, I'm sure you'd like attendees to come along to your session. So you'll need to think about a promotion strategy as you would for your face-to-face interactions that you would normally have. So at the Open University, we have a web page with our events listings. We also include recordings of previous sessions with the events so that students can just access this whenever they like if they can't attend at the time that we've advertised. Social media can be a good option at the moment, particularly as there's no current face-to-face word of mouth available, but you'd have to be okay with external individuals seeing your promoted events. Frequently, our students find out about training through their module websites on the virtual learning environment. So it's important to make use of those faculty contacts to maximise the reach. Next slide, please. So these are just some of my top tips for the technical side of online teaching. And I'm going to just take this opportunity to ask Amanda if there are any questions that keep coming up that I can answer within the next couple of minutes before I pass on to Fiona.
I'm just scrolling through and people have been asking about recording and we're saying that we could do it in Adobe Connect. What do you consider to be the ideal time for length of session has just come up?
That's a really good question. So we have some sessions that are half an hour, but they can range really. I think it depends on the kind of session that you'd like to produce and how much interactivity there is. I'd be hesitant to just be speaking for an hour straight, but it's possible to have an hour session as long as it's interspersed with activities where you can, and particularly encourage that kind of interactions between the students as well.
Okay, and the other thing is whether we tried any tools outside of Adobe Connect, you know, in our Adobe Connect sessions. So if we tried to say things like Mentimeter or anything like that, that was one question.
Yes, those kinds of things have been used before, Poll Everywhere as well, those kinds of things. But Adobe Connect has a poll feature that's inbuilt into the tool, so we don't really use that as much. But Mentimeter can be a really useful tool. It's also, I find that I use this a little bit in my previous workplace, and it's quite nice for that kind of interaction with each of your slides as well. So it kind of adds that to it. But yes, you can use that with Adobe Connect.